Hello everybody, this is Rick Pidcock, and I just want to share a few thoughts with you about this, about a phrase that Jesus said. It's actually, a lot of people believe it is the central teaching of what he taught while he was here on the earth, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself. It's something that we've all heard, whether you grew up Christian or, or not. We've all heard, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy. And it's a common phrase that that many of us have heard, but I want to talk about how we often talk about it and share some thoughts on that, and then I'd like to play around with it a little bit. So typically when I've heard evangelicals talk about the phrase, you will love your neighbor as you love yourself, they often say, well, we already know that we love ourselves because we're evil, we're wicked, and so we put ourselves first, and so we need to put others first. And I think that makes sense within the narrative that they have, but I also think that it really creates a very negative, unhealthy view of the self. And to illustrate this, I often look at worship lyrics, and if you look at the way we are, the self shows up in worship songs, people assume theologically that worship is glorifying God. It's not about us, it's not about ourselves, it's about God. It's about giving him the praise that he is due. And so worship song lyrics are all about glorifying God and telling God about how amazing God is. And then whenever the self shows up, in many cases, the self is invisible. Like we don't even appear in the songs. But when we do appear in the lyrics, it's always negative. Like, I was watching I was on Facebook the other day, and this ad came on for a church that had I guess it was for their Easter weekend. They put this wooden cross outside, and on each of the sides of the cross where the hands of Jesus would be, there was this slit, and this like red Kool-Aid looking stuff was coming out and flowing out it was like a water feature cross thing, and it was going down into this pool of red Kool-Aid that was supposed to look like blood. And they had this music playing, and the song started off, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing the lyrics, but it was like, I am a wretch, I am lost, I am dead. And it was like all this like really negative self-image language going on. And you see that all throughout worship lyrics. It's, I was lost, I was dead, I was, depraved, I was wicked, I was a wretch. And, I understand theologically why they're saying this. Like, I led worship in this world for 20 years. I grew up in evangelical Christianity. I understand all of the theology of sin and depravity and all of that kind of stuff that they believe. But what we need to see here in these lyrics is that what it's doing is it's creating this very negative self-image, and it's really disconnecting us from ourselves. Whether that's theologically appropriate or not, I'm not commenting on that right now. All I'm saying is we need to observe the fact that in these worship lyrics, if we show up, we're always typically referred to in very negative terms. And so this concept of, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Well, we already love ourselves because we're wicked. Like, that's really that response that evangelicals automatically immediately interpret this command with is very resonant with the way they view the self as revealed in their worship lyrics. So it's this negative view of the self. It's a view of the self that causes you not to trust yourself, causes you to feel disconnected from yourself, to doubt yourself, to look on yourself with like a mistrust, really kind of almost a detestable feeling to it, like ew, gross, like I was wicked, I was evil, I was disgusting. And then we, and so that's how we tend to view ourselves. That's how we tend to love ourselves. Now, you go to another part of Jesus' statement where he says that you were to love your enemies. And so I'll often hear evangelicals, well, if they want to go like a step deeper, they'll say the enemy, your greatest enemy is yourself, because you're wicked, you're depraved, you're evil, you're lost, you're, you know, all of these different negative connotation words again. Is something about like talking about ourselves as our enemy just really, it really resonates with us within that evangelical framework. And so I'm just wondering, like, okay, that's how we view ourselves. And the net effect is that it causes us not to look at ourselves, to not see ourselves. It causes us to be disconnected from ourselves. It causes us to look down on disdain with our, you know, to ourselves. And so that's typically how we see ourselves within evangelicalism. Okay, well, go back to Jesus' statement. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Is that how, you think that's how Jesus wants us to love our neighbors? To be disconnected from them, to mistrust them, to look on them as if they are detestable, depraved, despicable wretches. Is that what Jesus is calling us to? And I don't think so. I think what Jesus was referring to is, you're going to love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you love yourself in a negative, unhealthy way that disconnects you from yourself, that causes you to fear yourself, then that's going to show up in the way you treat others. It's going to show up in the way you love your neighbors. It's going to cause you to be disconnected from your neighbors, to mistrust your neighbors, to believe that violence toward your neighbors is justified because violence towards yourself is justified, you know, because of what we deserve with eternal conscious torment. And so the way you love yourself is directly connected to the way you love your neighbor. And so now to kind of reverse this a little bit, like what if we had a healthy view of the self? What if we loved ourselves with not an atonement theory based on retribution and deserved violence, but with an atonement theory of healing, of really becoming one, converging in healing through love. There are atonement theories out there, not penal substitutionary atonement. There are other atonement theories out there that do have this, more of this healing model, where we can become to see our own wonders and see our wounds and begin to see how, whether you want to call it sin or whatever is wrong with the world, has really eaten away at us and has taken away our childlike innocence and that original wonder and that original goodness that we have. And there are atonement theories that speak to becoming one again with ourselves in those ways. So if we could actually like see how beautiful we are, and like how would that affect the way we see our neighbors? Like suddenly we could love our neighbors in a healthy way, just like we love ourselves in a healthy way. And I think that's more of what Jesus was getting at. And another way we can kind of play with this a little bit is, what if instead of loving your neighbor as yourself, what if you loved yourself as your neighbor? Like, and this is where, speaking of our neighbors, there are other religions who have had this same concept. You know, Judaism has love your neighbor as yourself in Leviticus 19. Buddhism talked about loving your neighbor as yourself. Like that phrase first appeared, the earliest times was actually in Egyptian literature. Like this is something that religions have all agreed is something that that we're called to do, is to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Well, one of the ways I've learned from that is I've been reading some different Buddhist literature and stuff, and they'll talk about like seeing yourself as your neighbor, and they don't necessarily put it in those terms, but they'll talk about awareness. Like, you need to have awareness of, so let's say you're getting angry, you know, you're really just irate about something. Well, you can become lost in that anger. You can enter into this cycle of retribution where you then lash out at others because they deserve it, and then they lash back at you, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Or you can become aware of your anger, become aware of the fact, I'm angry right now, and so it's like suddenly you're seeing yourself from the outside as your neighbor, if that makes sense. You're observing what's going on, and you can experience that anger, and you can be aware of it, and then you can become, in that awareness, you can become aware of, what are the wonders that I have right now that I'm longing for? What are the wounds that are causing this? Suddenly, you're starting to look at yourself with empathy, with compassion, and by seeing yourself as your neighbor. And so I think that's one example that Christians can learn from Buddhists on the concept of awareness that we may not necessarily talk about so often, but it's something that they have in their understanding of consciousness and of spirituality that can really help us become more one with ourselves and become more one with our neighbors. And in doing so, that is exactly where Jesus said we were to be, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And where that community is converging, he says that's where he is in the midst of them. So I hope that encourages you to begin to think of yourself not in these overly negative terms, but to really begin to see yourself as your neighbor, to become aware of your wonders and wounds, and then to be able to love your neighbor as you love yourself.